In a secluded mountain cabin, one man's quest for peace ignites a battle against a relentless HOA queen determined to claim his sanctuary until he turns her schemes into a glittering defeat. I was 2 hours deep into the best nap I'd had in months, buried under 3 blankets while a soft snowstorm rattled the window panes when the front door rattled so hard I thought someone had taken a battering ram to it. I jolted upright, half convinced a bear had figured out how to knock. But when I stumbled over to the window and peeked through the frosted glass, I saw her standing there like a suburban gargoyle in a neon parka, clipboard tucked under her elbow like she was about to sight the wind for blowing the wrong way.
Is anyone in there?
Linda Krotman, queen of the HOA, destroyer of weekends and apparently now the self-appointed warden of my mountain cabin, was banging her gloved fist on my door as if the trees owed her an explanation for existing. I cracked the door open just enough for her voice to slap me awake. She didn't even bother with hello. She launched straight into it with that sugar-sour tone she used whenever she wanted something for free. "You need to unlock the guest wing immediately," she snapped, every word a cold puff of entitlement in the icy air. I stared at her, still half asleep, and almost laughed. Apparently, she decided my private cabin would make the perfect overflow motel for her cousin's wedding. The guest wing's locked for a reason, I told her, but she shoved a piece of paper at me anyway, some nonsense about community goodwill and contributing to neighborhood harmony.
That's got it.
I reminded her that this was my property, bought outright with money I earned by working far away from entitled people like her. She switched tactics so fast I nearly admired it. First came the threats about fines, then the guilt trips about how I'd be ruining a once-in-a-lifetime family memory. When that didn't work, she whipped out her phone, recording me like she'd caught Bigfoot hoarding spare bedrooms from the deserving masses. I told her to feel free to post it. Maybe someone would finally see how ridiculous she was. She called me selfish, unneighborly, and a disgrace to the mountain community, then stormed off down my steps without waiting for a response, her boots crunching through the fresh snow like angry punctuation marks. I closed the door, heart still drumming from the sudden confrontation, and leaned my forehead against the wood. I'd come up here for peace and silence. The cabin was my line in the sand between me and the constant noise of people demanding things I didn't owe them. I told myself she'd huff and puff for a day and then leave me alone. I told myself she'd find a motel in town like any sane person would. But as I shuffled back to the couch, I caught a flicker of movement on the security monitor I'd rigged to a pine tree out front.
Is anyone in
There she was, Linda Krotman, HOA tyrant, standing at the edge of my driveway, whispering furiously into her phone like she was calling in an airstrike. I turned up the volume and heard just enough to know this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She said something about making sure I'd regret crossing her, about calling the board, about how this cabin was practically community property anyway since I was never here to enjoy it properly. I sat down hard on the couch, the nap long forgotten, my mind already racing through every possible petty maneuver she could pull. I knew Linda. She wasn't the type to let an unlocked door stop her from getting her way. And if she thought she could muscle her way into my cabin with threats and fake fines, she was about to learn just how stubborn I could be when my solitude was on the line. I grabbed my old thermos from the table, poured the last of my coffee, and peered out the frosted window again. She was gone now, the snow swallowing her footprints faster than she could make them. I didn't know what she'd try next. I just knew that for the first time in months, I felt wide awake. And if Linda Krotman wanted a war over my locked guest wing, I was ready to dig in my heels and make this mountain my fortress. The only question now was how far she'd push before the whole thing came crashing down on her smug little clipboard. I woke up the next morning to the kind of silence that only makes sense when you know it's about to be broken. The snow had fallen thick overnight, blanketing the pines so heavily they bowed under the weight, and my truck sat under a fresh coat that would take at least an hour to shovel off. I stretched, my muscles sore from yesterday's unexpected adrenaline, and half convinced myself that maybe Linda had cooled off and gone back to whatever miserable nest she slithered out from. I made coffee, stood at the window, sipping it, and watched a pair of deer pick their delicate way through the yard. For a second, it almost felt like I'd imagined the whole thing, but then I saw it tacked to my front door with bright orange tape, flapping a little in the wind. I opened the door and yanked it down, the cold slapping my face awake faster than the coffee ever could. The notice was printed on HOA letterhead, the kind they use when they want to pretend they're the government. In big block letters, it claimed I was in violation of Article 7, subsection B, failure to participate in community goodwill and neighborly outreach. Below that was a laughably small fine, $50. But at the bottom, it threatened escalation, additional fines, and possible community review of my property privileges if I didn't comply. I snorted so hard I nearly choked on my coffee. Community goodwill. As if my guest wing was the local YMCA. I crumpled the paper into a ball and tossed it into the snow, then thought better of it and stuffed it in my pocket for evidence. Linda wanted to play games. Fine.
Yep.
I'd play, but not by her rules. By the time I made it to the community lodge down the hill, the so-called brunch was already in full swing. I could hear the chatter before I pushed through the double doors, the smell of cheap coffee and store-bought muffins filling the air. Linda stood at the center of it all, like she owned the place, flitting from table to table with her clipboard tucked under one arm and that fake smile that always made her teeth look sharper than they were. Her cousin's wedding guests were scattered around, balancing paper plates on their laps, talking in low murmurs. Some looked bored, others confused, but all of them turned when I stepped inside. Linda spotted me and her eyes narrowed, but she plastered that sweet grin back on and marched over like she was greeting an old friend. "There you are," she said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "I was just telling everyone how generous you were being." I could practically taste the venom behind her syrupy tone. "Generous," I said, pitching my voice just as loud. "That's news to me. You mean the part where you tried to strong-arm me into giving up my private cabin for free?" A few of the guests looked uncomfortable, shifting in their chairs.
Hello?
One man near the window piped up,
anyone in
"I thought
there?"
you said the cabin was booked for us, Linda."
It's really cold
She
out
shot him a
here.
look that could curdle milk. "It is booked," she said through clenched teeth. "He's just being difficult." I pulled my phone from my pocket and thumbed through my messages, turning the screen to the room so they could see the last conversation I'd had with Linda. No agreement, no promise, just a single text from her saying, "I assume you'll be reasonable about this." That was her entire contract. I scrolled through slowly, giving everyone a good look. Another woman, probably the bride-to-be's aunt or sister, raised her eyebrows and whispered something to her husband. Linda tried to snatch my phone,
Try it
but I
now.
stepped back and pocketed it again. "He's lying," she snapped, voice cracking. "He promised it to me months ago."
Yep. That's
I
got
turned
it.
to the crowd. "If any of you paid for lodging here, you got scammed. My cabin isn't for rent. It's not a hotel. And if she promised you free rooms, that's her problem." A nervous laugh bubbled from a few guests, but one guy, a big man in a cheap suit, stood up and gestured me over. "Look," he said, low enough that Linda couldn't hear, "my wife's parents came all the way from Ohio for this. They need a place to sleep tonight. I'll pay you cash, full price, no trouble." I looked him up and down. He seemed decent enough, not part of Linda's circus. I wanted to say yes just to prove I wasn't heartless. But the second I opened that door, I knew I'd never close it again. "Sorry," I said. "Not possible. The wing's locked up for repairs. Plus, it's my line in the sand." He nodded, disappointed but not angry. Behind me, Linda was sputtering to a small group, trying to spin it so fast I could almost see the wheels smoking. She caught my eye again and stormed over, lowering her voice to a hiss. "Fine. You want to play
Hello?
this game?
Is anyone
No
in there?
plowing for you this winter.
It's
Good
really
luck
cold
digging out by
here.
hand." I almost laughed in her face. I'd lived up here long enough to know which companies she could bully and which ones she couldn't. But it was the way she said it, like she'd already lined up every piece of her little revenge plan, that made my skin crawl. I left the lodge before I said something that would get me arrested for creative profanity. On the way out, I heard Linda's voice rise again, trying to calm her guests down. I trudged back up the trail to my truck, mind already working through the next move. If she thought cutting off my plow service would break me, she had another thing coming. But I knew her well enough to know she wouldn't stop there. If she couldn't get me to open that wing willingly, she'd find another way. Back at the cabin, I
Yep,
set my
that's
coffee mug
got
down
it.
on the porch railing and surveyed the fresh snowdrifts curling over the step. Then I turned and checked the security monitor again. It was grainy, half frozen, but good enough to catch movement if anyone tried to slip around back. Still, it wouldn't hurt to beef up my insurance. I texted Alex, an old friend who owed me more than a few favors. He knew how to make a presence known without making it obvious. Bring warm clothes, I typed. The HOA queen's going feral. He answered with a thumbs up and a question about whether I had enough beer stocked. That made me grin for the first time all morning. By the time the sun started dipping behind the ridge, I triple-checked the locks on every door and window, bolted the guest wing shut from the inside, and sprinkled a few motion lights around the back deck. It felt like overkill, but something told me Linda wouldn't care how much snow was falling if she thought she could slip in while I slept. I heated up a can of chile, ate standing at the window, watching flakes swirl down like confetti. Somewhere out there, she was sitting in her fancy warm house, scheming. I wondered if she'd try it tonight or wait until the wedding guests were desperate enough to storm my place like polite, pitchfork-wielding villagers.
Anyone in there?
Either way, I wasn't backing down.
It's really cold out
I'd bought
here.
this cabin to be left alone. I'd earned every square foot of these creaky old floors and the view that didn't come with 1,000 strings attached. And if Linda Croton thought she could turn my sanctuary into her personal bed and breakfast, she was about to learn that I didn't just dig in my heels. I dug trenches. I flicked off the porch light, locked the door one last time, and let the snow swallow the cabin whole. If she came for me tonight, she'd find I was more than ready to greet her at the door. The storm came down heavier than the forecast had warned, dumping thick drifts that buried my truck in white up to the windows by dawn. I half expected to wake up to the sound of Linda's voice drilling into my eardrums. But instead, it was the quiet that got me, the kind of quiet that made every creak in the cabin feel like a warning. I pulled on my boots and cracked the front door open just enough to let the cold slap me fully awake. The porch was undisturbed, the yard blanketed like a fresh canvas that dared anyone to leave their mark. I stepped out to check the cameras and saw the tiny blinking light that meant they'd caught something overnight. Back inside, I scrubbed the sleep from my eyes and hit play on the footage, half dreading what I'd see and half hoping it was just a raccoon rooting around for scraps. But there she was, like a ghost in a neon parka, trudging up my driveway just before 2 o'clock in the morning with a man in tow, hunched and fumbling with a heavy bag. They stood under my porch light, heads bent close. She pointed at the guest wing door, and the man pulled a shiny set of tools from his coat. My blood went hot and cold at the same time. I watched them fiddle with the lock until the video glitched from the falling snow, but not before I caught Linda's grin when she thought the camera couldn't see her face. The footage ended with the door to the guest wing swinging inward and the light flicking on inside. My pulse hammered in my ears. They'd gotten in. I pulled on my coat and stomped through the snow to the side of the cabin.
Hello?
The lock was intact
anyone
now,
in there?
snapped shut again, but a fresh boot print near the window
It's
gave it
really
away.
cold out here.
They'd relocked it to make it look untouched, counting on me not to check. I kicked the snow off my boots at the threshold and stepped into the guest wing, flipping on the overhead light. Everything looked normal at first, the dusty old couches, the stone fireplace, the stack of drop cloths I'd left folded over the furniture while I decided if I was going to remodel or just burn the whole thing down out of spite. Then I spotted it, a small corner of carpet lifted near the closet, a fresh scratch on the lock where the closet door met the frame. They'd stashed something or scouted it for later. I knelt and peeled back the carpet, but there was nothing underneath except the cold boards. Whatever she'd done, she hadn't finished. My hands were shaking, but not from the cold. She'd crossed the line I'd drawn in thick black ink. And now the game was different. I went back inside, called the sheriff's office, and asked for Deputy Warren, the only local cop who didn't treat HOA squabbles like kindergarten spats. He answered on the second ring, half amused when I told him Linda had broken in with a locksmith at 2 o'clock in the morning. I could hear him scribbling down notes, his coffee cup clinking against his desk. "You want me to come up and take a statement?" he asked, and I could tell he already knew the answer. "No," I said. "Not yet. Let her think she got away with it. I want her deep enough in this mess that she can't wriggle out when you show up." He gave a low whistle but agreed to wait it out if I promised to call if she tried it again. I hung up and stared at the guest wing door like it was daring me to open it again. I needed more than cameras. I needed something to remind her that the next time she came creeping up here with her locksmith, she'd get a face full of consequences she couldn't spin to the HOA board. That was where Alex came in. He arrived just before noon in his battered old Jeep, grinning at the snow like it was an old friend.
Hello?
He stomped inside, tossed
Is
his bag in
anyone
the
in there?
corner, and cracked open the beer I handed him before he even took off his boots. "So, the Queen's lost her crown, huh?" he said, settling into my sagging couch like he owned it. "Not yet," I said. "But she's about to choke on it if she doesn't back off." We spent the afternoon rigging up more motion sensors, running fresh wire to the camera by the back deck so it wouldn't die when the temps dropped again. Alex suggested we add a little surprise in the guest wing, too, something harmless but enough to spook her if she tried slipping in again. By the time the sun dipped behind the pines, we'd turned the cozy old wing into a clown trap. Nothing dangerous, just a few glitter bombs tied to the closet handle, a fake alarm siren wired to the breaker that would wail if someone flicked the wrong switch, and a motion-triggered speaker that would blast my recorded voice shouting, "Smile, you're trespassing," at full volume. It was juvenile, maybe, but satisfying. We cracked another round of beers on the porch and watched the last orange streaks fade behind the ridge. Alex nudged me with his shoulder and asked if I really thought she'd be dumb enough to come back after being caught once. I didn't answer because I already knew the truth. Linda wasn't the type to back down because she'd been caught. She was the type to double down, convinced she was entitled to whatever she wanted and that consequences were for other people. Sure enough, the next morning proved me right. We woke up to a parade of cars parked along my narrow mountain road, tires half buried in the snow, doors swinging open like a clown car at the circus. People I'd never seen before milled around my yard, balancing paper plates and plastic cups while Linda stood in the center, directing traffic with that damn clipboard. She'd turned my property line into her own private barbecue. Alex and I stood at the window, watching them set up folding tables so close to my porch steps I could hear their tiny Bluetooth speaker blasting wedding party music over the wind. Alex sipped his coffee and raised an eyebrow. "You want me to get the shovel or the shotgun?" he asked, deadpan, and I almost spit my drink laughing. "Neither," I said.
It's really cold out
"Let's
here.
watch." Linda spotted us through the window, gave me a smug little wave, then turned her back on us like she'd just won the biggest battle of her life. She hadn't stepped foot inside the cabin yet, but it was obvious what she was doing, a show of force, a reminder that she could bring the neighborhood circus right up to my door anytime she pleased. I let her have it. I even waited until she was busy bragging to some cousin about how they'd all be cozy in the guest wing tonight before slipping out the back door with Alex and ducking into the wing through the side entrance. We checked the traps twice, made sure the cameras were rolling, and the battery packs charged. If Linda wanted a free stay, she'd get it, complete with a glitter shower, a screaming alarm, and footage that would make her the star of the next HOA newsletter.
Yep, that's got
By
it.
dusk, the smell of overcooked burgers and cheap beer clung to my porch like stale perfume. Strangers kept trying to peek in my windows like they were waiting for an open house. I caught one man trying my front door and told him if he didn't step off my porch, I'd call the sheriff to haul him off for trespassing. He raised his hands, apologized, but it didn't stop him from drifting back to Linda to complain. I heard her say, "Don't worry about him. He'll cave once he sees we're not leaving." She had no idea I'd already laid the perfect trap. That night, after the last firework of her tacky little barbecue fizzled out, I sat in the dark by the window, Alex next to me, 2 beers sweating on the table between us. We waited for the sound we both knew would come, a door creaking open, the startled squawk of an alarm, the pop of a glitter bomb rigged to make Linda's precious power move look like a clown show. When the sun rose the next morning, it found Linda's mess still scattered across my yard like the remnants of a parade that nobody had bothered to clean up, paper plates half buried in the snow, footprints trampling the pine needles flat, an abandoned folding chair tipped over by the steps like it had surrendered halfway through the party. The guest wing door was still wide open from her midnight glitter
Is anyone
fiasco.
in there?
I stood there on the porch with Alex, sipping
Really
coffee,
cold
the
out
steam
here.
curling around my face while I stared at the chaos she'd left behind. He nudged my shoulder and asked if I'd slept at all, and I shook my head. I hadn't needed sleep. I'd been too busy replaying that security footage over and over, watching Linda flail in the dark while a burst of cheap craft glitter turned her hair into a disco ball. She'd fled so fast she'd left her fancy monogram thermos on the side table by the guest bed. I picked it up now, twirling it in my hand like a trophy before setting it down on the porch railing for her to see when she inevitably came crawling back. And I knew she would because Linda didn't lose. At least not in her mind. She twisted every setback into a fresh chance to spin her story tighter until everyone else was tangled up and she was the only one who could explain what really happened. I didn't have to wait long to see her next move. By mid-morning, my phone buzzed with a message from an old neighbor 2 streets down. He'd overheard Linda at the community center telling anyone who'd listen that she'd been forced to break in because I'd promised the guest wing months ago and then changed the locks to trap her inside so I could record her for blackmail. She was calling it harassment, an invasion of privacy. And worst of all, she was spinning it into some weird story about how the cabin wasn't even really mine, that technically it was part of a community trust because it used to belong to a local family. That part was almost impressive in its reach. Alex leaned against the porch post and read the message over my shoulder, then whistled low through his teeth. "She's doubling down," he said. "You going to let her keep the stage?" "Not a chance," I said. It was time to pull the rug out from under her all the way. We packed up every scrap of footage from the break-in, the barbecue, the glitter bomb fiasco, every text she'd sent me, even the fake violation notice she'd nailed to my door. We loaded it all onto a thumb drive and headed into town. The community hall was about as cheerful as a tax office in February, but when I stepped inside, I almost laughed out loud.
It's cold out here.
Linda had thrown together a last-minute, so-called fundraiser, tables lined with finger foods and lukewarm coffee, cheap banners flapping from the ceiling announcing an exclusive opportunity to invest in a special neighborhood asset. She stood on a low platform near the back, voice ringing through the echoing room as she pitched her latest scam to a handful of neighbors I recognized and a dozen strangers who clearly didn't know her history yet. I leaned in the doorway and watched her work the crowd. She gestured at a blown-up photo of my cabin projected onto a portable screen behind her, talking about how the community deserved access to a luxury getaway in the mountains. She used words like community investment and shared prosperity and sustainable rental income, spinning it all so smoothly you'd think she'd invented generosity herself.
Yep, that's got it.
Beside me, Alex muttered that if she'd been born with even half a conscience, she'd be unstoppable in politics. I didn't respond. I just waited for her to say the part one knew she'd rehearsed in front of a mirror. Sure enough, she pointed at the screen and told everyone that the guest wing was already up and running thanks to her personal connections and that shares were available today only for an upfront contribution. I could practically see the dollar signs dancing in a few people's eyes as they nudged each other. That was my cue. I stepped forward, the old wood floor creaking under my boots, louder than her microphone. She saw me and faltered just for a second, her smile freezing before she forced it wider. I didn't say a word at first. I just walked up to the platform, plugged my thumb drive into the side of her rented projector, and let the first clip roll. The room went silent as Linda's break-in played out larger than life on the wall behind her, her voice on the hidden mic clear as day, barking orders at the locksmith, bragging about how she'd relock it so I wouldn't notice. The glitter bomb scene came next, a few people laughing outright when they saw her scream and flail like she'd stepped on a snake. I let it play just long enough for the laughter to turn into mutters and the mutters to turn into questions. Then I cut the video and turned to face the room. I laid out everything she'd done, every lie, every trick, every threat to find me or block my driveway or shame me into giving up my property. I told them about the fake notices, the fake goodwill violation, the phony timeshare plan she'd cooked up to line her pockets while pretending it was for the community's benefit. A few people demanded she answer, but Linda just stood there, frozen, her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield she'd forgotten how to use. Someone at the back started recording on their phone. I didn't mind. Let them record. Let them share it with the whole neighborhood and the next town over if they wanted. Linda finally found her voice, squeaking out something about how I'd edited the footage, twisted her words, that this was just a misunderstanding. But nobody was buying it now. The same people who'd clapped for her fundraiser pitch were drifting away from the table, slipping their checkbooks back into purses and coat pockets. One man demanded his deposit back on the spot. Another said he'd call the sheriff if she didn't refund him by the end of the day. I could see the panic rising behind her eyes like floodwater. She tried to blame her cousin, claiming she'd been pressured into helping plan the wedding and the whole thing got out of hand. But her cousin was standing by the door, arms crossed, shaking his head slowly. He wanted no part of it. Then Deputy Warren stepped through the back entrance, head dusted with snow, looking around the room like he'd walked into his favorite soap opera. He saw me, gave me the smallest nod, then turned to Linda. "Ma'am, I need to ask you a few questions about some allegations of trespassing, fraud, and potential misuse of HOA funds." She squeaked something about needing her lawyer and tried to make for the door, but two of her unhappy investors stepped in her way. I let Warren do his job, slipping the thumb drive into his hand as I passed. Alex and I stepped outside into the brittle afternoon light.
Is anyone in
The
there?
wind cut through my jacket, but I barely felt it.
It's really cold out
I should have
here.
felt triumph, but all I felt was tired, like the high drama of it all had burned out some final fuse in my head. Alex slapped my shoulder and told me I should celebrate. I said I would after I knew she wouldn't slither out of this, too. We drove back up the mountain in silence, except for the crunch of the tires on packed snow. At the cabin, we sat on the porch again, the same way we had the night before. Only now the yard was empty, except for the mess she'd left behind. I sipped my coffee, breathing in the cold, feeling the quiet pressing around me again like a blanket I'd fought too hard to lose. Linda might drag this out with lawyers and board meetings and angry neighbors whispering her side of the story. I woke up the next morning to the sound of my phone buzzing itself off the nightstand and thunking onto the cabin floor. It was early, too early for anyone decent to be calling, which meant it had to be someone who thought decency didn't apply to them. I leaned over the edge of the bed, fished the phone from where it had wedged under a boot, and squinted at the screen. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something told me not to. When I answered, there was a pause, like whoever was on the other end was checking to see if I'd really picked up. Then came her voice, syrupy sweet in a way that made my skin crawl before she'd even gotten 5 words out. She said she wanted to talk. Said she thought maybe we'd both taken things too far. Said maybe we should sit down like reasonable neighbors and settle this privately before it got any messier than it already was. I pictured her sitting in her kitchen, probably in that robe she wore to HOA meetings when she wanted to look important but approachable, her hair twisted up tight enough to pull the skin at her temples smooth. I told her I'd think about it and hung up before she could say more. Alex was still asleep on the couch, one arm flung over his face, breathing like he'd run a marathon in his dreams. I let him sleep. I needed to think.
Hello?
I stepped out
anyone
onto
in
the porch
there?
with my coffee, the steam trailing into the cold dawn like
really
it couldn't
cold
wait to
out
get
here.
away. Down in the yard, the last of Linda's party trash was half buried under fresh snow, just enough to soften the edges, but not enough to hide what it was. A reminder that some people can't help leaving a mess behind. I took a sip, let the bitterness sit on my tongue, and thought about how easy it would be to just let her come up here, listen to her apology, shake her hand, and pretend all this could be undone with a few polite words. But that was Linda's trick. She'd wrap her lies in the silk of civility, put just enough sugar on them that you almost missed the poison underneath. She'd smile, promise it was all just a misunderstanding, then by next month, she'd be telling everyone I'd agreed to rent her the whole cabin for the entire winter. No, if this was going to end, it was going to end where she couldn't spin it anymore. Alex woke up when the smell of fresh coffee drifted over. He padded out to the porch, blanket wrapped around his shoulders like a cape, hair sticking up in every direction. He asked what was next, and I told him Linda wanted to talk. He didn't laugh exactly, but the noise he made said enough. He asked if I wanted him to stick around, and I told him I did. I wanted to witness when the queen of the HOA came crawling up my driveway one last time. She showed up just after lunch, her car creeping up the snowy track so slow it looked like she was afraid the tires would slip on her own hubris. She stepped out, all smiles and open palms, dressed like she was headed to church, even though we both knew she'd have better luck finding forgiveness at a fire sale. She didn't even glance at Alex, who stood on the porch next to me, arms crossed, face blank. She launched straight into her script, talking about misunderstandings and community spirit, and how she just wanted to make things right before lawyers and gossip turned it all into something ugly for everyone. I let her talk until her words looped back around, soft and careful, wrapping the poison pill in a bow. When she finally stopped for breath, I asked her what exactly she was
Hello?
offering.
Is anyone
She
in
brightened,
there?
like she thought she'd hook me. She said
really
she'd drop the
cold out
violation
here.
notices, make sure the HOA forgot about any fines, promised not to press her phony harassment claims. In return, she wanted me to quietly agree to let a few guests use the wing for a week or two every season, just to smooth things over. She said it like she was offering me a favor. I took a step forward, the snow crunching under my boot. I told her no. I told her there would be no more guests, no more lies, no more pretending my private property was some communal reward for her loyal followers. I told her I'd be seeing her in small claims court for trespassing, property damage, and harassment.
Try it now.
I told her the sheriff already had every scrap of evidence, every petty threat she'd nailed to my door, every piece of her midnight break-in stunt recorded and ready to roll.
It.
Her smile flickered then, just for a heartbeat, before she slapped it back on. She tried to pivot, offering to settle privately for cash. She said she could write a check right now, pay for the repairs, pay for the trouble, make it all disappear so we could both get on with our lives. I looked her right in the eye and told her I didn't want her money. I wanted her gone for good. Her eyes narrowed, the mask slipping just enough to show the anger simmering underneath. She asked me if I really thought I could stand alone up here forever, if I really believed the board wouldn't back her once she spun her story just right. I told her I wasn't standing alone. I told her I'd sold the guest wing. She blinked, confused, and I let the silence stretch until she asked what I meant. I explained slowly that I'd signed the papers that very morning. The entire guest wing and the forested strip behind it had been donated to a conservation trust. Protected land now. No development, no rentals, no weddings, no HOA strings attached. It was no longer mine to give and definitely not hers to take. Her mouth opened and closed twice, the words getting stuck behind the fury that had nowhere to go. She started to say something about contracts, but Alex cut her off, saying she could file whatever paperwork she wanted, but good luck suing a trust that didn't answer to her board. She turned her glare on him, but he just smiled back, the picture of calm. She tried one last jab, saying I'd regret this when I needed the neighborhood's goodwill to plow my driveway or fix the road after the next storm. I told her I'd regret nothing except ever letting her set foot on my porch in the first place. I thanked her, real polite, for reminding me why I'd bought this cabin so far from town. For reminding me that peace wasn't something people handed you. It was something you protected with both hands and the spine to say no over and over again if you had to. She didn't have an answer for that. She spun on her heel, her fancy boots slipping a little on the icy step, and stomped back to her car like she could erase the humiliation with every crunch of snow under her heels. Alex and I watched her fishtail down the drive, her engine revving too loud, her tires spraying slush like a toddler throwing a tantrum. When she was gone, we went inside and poured 2 mugs of coffee stronger than any beer in my fridge. We sat at the kitchen table, boots dripping meltwater on the floor, the heater humming low. I felt the tiredness settle in my bones, but it was a good tired, the kind that came when you knew the fight was over, and you'd come off the other side with your walls still standing. Alex asked if I'd miss the extra space now that the wing belonged to the trees again. I told him I'd rather share it with the deer in the snow and the wind than ever see Linda's clipboard at my door again. He raised his mug to that, and I clinked mine against his. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, but it couldn't get in. Nothing could. Not anymore. The cabin was mine again. Quiet. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I felt exactly what I'd come up here for in the first place. Alone, but never lonely. Ready for whatever came next.
Is anyone in there?